Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to, because it's coming up on the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we just happen to have a historian in our midst. Let me just share some of Professor Manu's biography before he gets started. Professor Manu Ampim is a historian and a primary firsthand researcher specializing in African and African-American history and culture. He has earned a master's degree of arts in history and African-American studies from Morgan State University in 1989. He has taught in the Department of History at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, and at San Francisco State University. Oh boy, what happened there? Was that you, Manu? Did you do
sorry,
that?
Brother.
All right.
I'm sorry.
Hey, listen, Manu, I was just reading his biography. You know, he's eager to get started. He won't even let me get a chance to read his biography. But let me just say, Manu has done a lot of great things dealing with primary research, his books. And one of the things that is most notable to me is the Willie Lynch thing. You know, that was introduced at the Million Man March, and Professor Manu didn't accept it. And he did research, and he showed where that really was not a truism, and brought out who really came up with that. And anyway, he does primary research. He's a great scholar. I'm happy to know him. And without further ado, I want to present Professor Manu Ampim.
Please let everybody know how much he's contributed to WOZE and his teachings.
Go ahead. You can do that.
I don't remember everything, but I know he's taught some classes and he's been very, very active. And as his schedule got more and more busy, you know, he was not able to spend as much time with us, but we do get him like today from time to time. But he has really contributed a lot of wonderful history, ancient history, to the WOZE knowledge base. And that's where you know Black knowledge matters.
All right. All right. Well, that is a ringing endorsement, I would say, to introduce our professor. Go ahead, Professor Ampim.
Thank you, Minister Imhotep, and also Sister Fu for adding in a little bit. I appreciate all of you taking time out. And I did my master's thesis at Morgan State University back in the 80s on the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King, because at the time I had heard a couple speeches. And I said, you know what, if people heard this version of King in the period of 1966 and 67 and early 68, when the hot coals hit his lips, they would have a different perspective on King. And then I had organized students on campus, and my mentor, the late Walimu Gary Ware, had got some students, and they surprised me at an event and gave me a book. And when I started going through this book about a lot of Dr. King's sermons, his writing, his essays, his press conferences, excerpts from his book, I was really stunned that Dr. King was grossly misrepresented. So I decided, with all of the choices I had, to do my master's thesis on Dr. King, to not do like a lot of my colleagues at the time, which was really just to get a degree and just choose any old topic, but and just to get through with it. For me, I wanted to choose a topic that I can make a contribution with. And that's why I decided to bust up the presentation that was generally given regarding Dr. King, who I argue is the most misunderstood and misrepresented figure in US history. So I want to be as brief as I can, really, to share with you just one aspect of my work on the revolutionary Dr. King, because, you know, as Minister Imhotep said, this is the season where people are focusing on King and they start talking about the dream, but they don't share the nightmare that he wrote about and talked about. And they don't share when he says that the hallmark of any life is shattered dreams. And he began to talk about that. He said his dream blew up when soon after he talked about it in August of 1963 in Washington, D.C. with the March on Washington, when 4 little girls were blown up and murdered in their own church. And he began to go down a whole list of tragedies against Black people right after the March on Washington. That usually left out of the record. And so is a bunch of other materials that are really appalling when you look at what scholars have deliberately omitted from the record. And even if, in like last year, I had shared that if we look at arguably the most popular speech in the history of the US, the I Have a Dream speech, the distortions are great. Most people don't know that Dr. King twice in the speech condemned police brutality, and that he condemned as he said, the vicious racists from Alabama, and that he went on to make some amazing criticisms, but those are usually left out and omitted. But that's not what I want to focus on today. I want to address this topic, and I'll show my slides to really explain what I would like to share with you. And I've been sharing this, by the way, since I moved back to the States in the early 90s, this information. So it's been 30 years, and I really have to publish my work and publish my book. This is just a one like small section of my master's thesis on the revolutionary Dr. King. And so what I would like to share with you tonight is Dr. King as a leading human rights activist. So those that present him as a civil rights activist, they've distorted King, just like those that present him as nothing but someone who's focused on integration. That's a great distortion as well. People who promote King as just someone who's the Prince of Peace, that's a distortion when we look at the records. And so I want to at least share with you some of that in general, but specifically to focus on human rights and Black power, because here's where many people, unfortunately, they downplay or dismiss King because they want to embrace Malcolm when they don't understand that King was far more progressive. Before Malcolm began to embrace Africa, King was already embracing Africa and the African liberation movement. You can see this in his essays, his sermons. And so like the birth of a new age, for example, if you read that, you say, wow. In fact, it was Dr. King who went to Ghana to honor Kwame Nkrumah in 1957 with the independence of Ghana. And by the way, the biggest file, literally, when you go to the archives, as I did, so I'm not talking from opinion, I'm talking about from the primary research that I did in the archives and going through all of his records. I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records in the archives and his speeches, his press conferences, his sermons, you name it. And Dr. King, the biggest file literally that he has in the archive is the file on the decolonization or the freedom movement in Africa. And what's amazing about that is that that's not entirely unknown, but you don't find any biographers or writers focusing on that because it doesn't fit the script. It doesn't fit the propaganda. I learned this not by me going to the archives first. I learned that the biggest file on Africa, the biggest file was his file on Africa than any other topic, was the work of David Garrow, who wrote Bearing the Cross. He wrote that. So I used his notes to go to the archives, to go to the King Center, to go to the FBI headquarters, to go to the Muger collection in Boston. I went to these places and spent time. My advisor did not advise that we go to places to do that level of research. But as I said earlier, I wanted to make a contribution. I didn't want to just get by and just finish the master's degree and check off a box. No, I didn't. That was not my focus. So when I used David Garrow's note, his passing statement about King in Africa, that's what intrigued me. And he's right. But if you look at David Garrow's 700+ page book entitled Bearing the Cross, you would not get any idea that King focused that much on Africa. So the man makes that statement in his book, but this is King's biggest concern. This is why it's the biggest file with the most correspondence and the most records, but yet he does not write about that. How do you say that this is the man's main focus? It's the biggest file, the biggest amount of papers in the archive, and that's not reflected in your massive book because it's a propaganda book. That's why David Garrow wins the Pulitzer Prize, and and he's a master at skipping over the parts of Dr. King's statements, press statements, his articles, his books, and statements to his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. David Garrow uses ellipsis marks, you know, those 3 dots, to skip over the part that contradicts what David Garrow is saying. So David Garrow, he's not the only one, but David Garrow, and then I'm gonna move on to what I really want to say, but to show you the distortions here, David Garrow would take a speech and summarize the speech in his book of Bearing Across. And because it might be a complete page summarizing the article and with a number of footnotes, you would think that, wow, this is a thorough summary. No, not when you go to the original. You say, what? He left out these paragraphs? This is absolute fraudulent scholarship. When you leave out the very paragraphs when King is questioning whether or not the method of nonviolence is going to work. He didn't know. He thought that in a perfect world, let's try it. This is why Dr. King never, and they say never say never. No, say never when you can document it. Dr. King never condemns the African liberation movements on the continent. In fact, he rejoiced with them and consistently supported them. And this is amazing how the public still is not fully aware of it. But I'm not entirely surprised, because the full court press has been out there to misrepresent King, who's been taken from the streets as an activist and then elevated as an abstract dreamer. And folks have been very successful in creating King the myth and not King the man and the activist. So let me move forward and then share with you. You all are an informed audience, so I want to slightly challenge you without going online. Now you can check, and I know Imhotep's got all those books. So, and y'all got,
I have Garrow's book. It's like 714 pages.
Okay, exactly. Okay, so look, I want to slightly and gently challenge all of you.
Right.
Without going online, you can use your own, if you got your own library or your memory, is to write down. Please write down. Don't cheat now. Write down the books that Dr. King wrote. I'm not even going to give you the number of books he wrote. Normally I do, but this is, we'll say, so I'm at home so I can challenge you. I'm not going to give you the number, but please write down the books that he wrote. Now, remember, as you know, he's arguably the most popular man in the history of America. So I'm getting at something here. So just we'll give you a few minutes to write down the books. Now, you don't have to have read them. That would be great, but we'll give you a break, at least if you're aware of the books. And then I want to share with you why it is I'm totally convinced that Dr. King is the most misrepresented he's the most misrepresented and distorted figure in the history of the country, starting with the I Have a Dream speech. So 5 books, 6 books, 7. How many did he write? Was it 3? Let's see. Let's give you a couple.
7, didn't it? Wasn't it 7?
Okay, we're going to give you a few minutes.
Oh, okay, all right.
And then we'll see. Okay, Bill's got something in the chat. Okay, Chaos or Community is it's not the title, it's the subtitle of a book. Anybody know, Mr. Mahdi, he mentions Chaos or Community. Who knows the full title, the main title of that book, Chaos or Community? Because that's the last book he wrote, by the way.
Where do we go from here?
All right, very good. Where do we go from here? And then
right, I couldn't remember that part. Thank you.
All right. He's asking the question, do we go to Chaos or Community? And that book, if people read it, they'll know that he is not focusing on integration, not at all. He's not focusing on just dealing with domestic issues. You'll see that he embraces Black power. He wasn't enthralled with it as a term, but as a concept to implement. Absolutely. Okay. So what are the books? What do we have? So we have Why We Can't Wait. Yes, that is certainly one. Where do we go from here? And the subtitle is Chaos or Community, Stride Towards Freedom. Very good. Okay, let me challenge Jeff here. Okay, Stride Towards Freedom was a book focused on what campaign? What campaign was he describing with that book?
I got to go back and look at it because I read it partially of it, but I can't remember.
Okay, all right. So while you're doing that, so let's challenge Brother Bill. So what campaign was Dr. King focused on when he wrote Why We Can't Wait? Okay, and you know what?
Is it the Poor People's Campaign?
No, the Poor People's Campaign was in '68, the year he was assassinated, and they were organizing it in '67. Stride Towards Freedom. What was the campaign? Why We Can't Wait. What was the name of the campaign in '63? I think William Hotep, you got your hand up.
Okay, I think I was answering the question. So it was the Montgomery bus boycott movement, wasn't it?
For Stride Towards Freedom. Okay, yeah, very good. So the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and '56. So he says Stride Towards Freedom. And then he wrote Why We Can't Wait as well, because the white nationalists were saying, you know what, Dr. King, you ain't nothing but a troublemaker. You come to our town and you get all of the so-called Negroes all riled up. We have peaceful and very good race relations. You need to wait for progress to take place. We got good relations, so why don't you just wait? And then King came up with a tremendous response. He said, time is neutral. It can be used effectively or ineffectively. The problem in America is that those of ill will, the negative people, use time far more effectively than those of goodwill. And here's why we can't wait. So he slammed his opponents and told them what time it was. We have any other books? Okay, so let me help you out. He wrote 5 books. And now Dr. King, he worked 20-hour days. And the man literally was flying hundreds of thousands of miles, they calculated, every year. So how would he ever spend time or carve out time to write books? Well, every year around January, right around this time, he would go to Jamaica. He would go to Jamaica and he would do some R&R, because one of the things that frustrated Dr. King is not being fresh, not being mentally astute, and having the mental agility to address all of the issues that were coming at him in the Black community. So he said that this was mandatory. So Stride Towards Freedom, Why We Can't Wait. Of course, he's a minister. He was a minister in a family of ministers, Baptist ministers. So Strength to Love. Trumpet of Conscience. This was a series of lectures in Canada called the Massey Lectures. So this was in '67, the Trumpet of Conscience, and King was beginning to discuss, along with his organization, the Poor People's Campaign that he began to organize, because for him, they hadn't won any victories in a while, no legislation. So King and his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they envisioned a campaign to take over Washington, D.C. And so where do we go from here? Chaos or Community. This was his last book that he wrote. And it's amazing that this book is not front and center when people are talking about, quote unquote, living the dream. What dream? This was a practical man who had a plan. And on his birthday, he wasn't riding no freedom train and all of that. He was at his house meeting with activists, including Cesar Chavez and others, about how do they organize this massive multiracial poor people's campaign to do what exactly? To take over Washington, D.C., literally, and to camp out until there was a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged in the billions of dollars. And he said to the Black Power advocates like Kwame Ture and others who wanted to blow everything up, they said, brothers, now they thought they were meeting privately in D.C., but come on, that's the FBI main headquarters. They had everything taped. How do you know that, Professor? Because I've seen the records. And if you want to look at the records at the FBI headquarters, you got to go to a file named Black Nationalist Hate Groups. Literally, Black Nationalist Hate Groups. They all were considered hate groups by the outrageous FBI that was run by white men who didn't respect anybody. And so they thought they were meeting privately. They were not. King and his group were meeting with a lot of the Black Power advocates to figure out, what do we do now? Because the Civil Rights Bill had been passed in '64, the Voting Rights Bill had been passed in '65, and yet there was no tangible progress towards equality and the acquisition of power. So King said, look, the Poor People's Campaign is, this is his words, the last desperate attempt for nonviolence. He said, brothers, give us like 3 months to see if we can shake up the government. So it'll be no business as usual. They were going to have thousands of people camped out in Washington, D.C. on the mall to make sure that there would be no vehicular traffic into the Capitol building and that there will be no pedestrian traffic. And at the same time, they were organized to jam up all the phone lines, no business as usual. And then the next phase of that taking over DC, guess what? To do what King said was to dislocate the cities of America. So he said that, look, our strategy was to dislocate a city, cripple the city without destroying it. This is how he explained it. To cripple it without destroying. In other words, we don't need to tear down the buildings, but we're going to cripple operations until there's a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. And so that's when the FBI moved on King to make sure that he did not implement what the plans were with the Poor People's Campaign, which was scheduled for late April of 68. He was assassinated on April 4th of 68. The last book, so these are the 5 books he wrote. I'm going to put a 6th book on here. He didn't write it, but I find, and this is the book actually that was given to me by my late mentor and my student colleagues at Morgan State. And when I got this book as a gift from my leadership on campus, it started reading the essays, the sermons, and the interviews, like the Playboy interview he gave. King used any source he could to get the word out, or his essay on a testament of hope. People be shocked at what Dr. King said. He's embracing armed revolutionary movements. He said, look, we need to be patient with the younger nations in the world and recognize that they have to go through the same extremism, revolution, and violence that formed our own country. And that we need to embrace these barefoot and shirtless people. So this book is not one he wrote, The Testament of Hope, but it is edited by James Washington. And it says the essential writings and speeches of King. And it's a very good book that compiles not most, but many important, not all, but many important records of King from 56 to after his death. It was up until 69. So I would recommend A Testament of Hope. So it's important that we at least read the man. It's amazing how people will say it ain't so. What do you mean it ain't so? You haven't read a word by Dr. King, but yet you disagree. Documentation beats common sense. What do you mean you disagree? You know, so I don't need to really press this with you all, but typically in an audience, I would jam people up and make it clear that they ain't read a single word by King, so you have no argument to say it ain't so. How are you going to argue against something and you haven't even looked at the record? You know, so anyway, check this out. How many of you listed this one? Now you see the title, The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. And look, check this out. Look, I was at Barnes and Nobles in Jack London Square in Oakland. I had already finished my master's thesis, which was finished in 89. I moved back to the Bay Area, and this was sometime in the 90s, or not, maybe a little bit later. But when I first saw this at Barnes and Nobles, guess what my response was? I was shocked. You know why? Because I had never seen this. And I said, wait a minute. How can I spend thousands of hours in the archives going through every single piece of evidence, every document, and listening to all of his speeches? How can I have missed probably one of the most important records, the autobiography of Dr. King? I said, damn, how can I have done this? I was careful. I spent a couple of years. So what I did was, folks, I literally walked away from that section of the bookstore, took a walk. I said, no, let me go back. I'm afraid to look at this thing, but I got to look at it. Now, how can I have overlooked it? So then I kind of opened the book. I'm afraid that it's accurate. I said, no, it cannot be. There's no way that I could have missed it. And I opened it up. I said, as I thought, this is fraudulent. Dr. King never even thought about, he never told anybody, he has no notes. He didn't set aside any material for an autobiography. This was created by the man there at Stanford, Claiborne Carson, and the late Coretta Scott King. So it's not the autobiography of Dr. King. It should be the accurate title, The Selected Writings of Dr. King, and a biography. This is absolutely fraudulent. What Claiborne Carson and Coretta Scott King did, the late Coretta Scott King, they selected what they wanted to put in this quote unquote autobiography in order to tell a particular story. They didn't put certain things in there that bust up this myth about King being some, abstract dreamer and the apostle of peace and all of that. If I was writing his quote autobiography, I would certainly would have put in Black Power Defined and a lot of other materials. How are you going to write somebody else's self story? That's crazy. Auto means self and biography means story. You can't write somebody. I don't care if you are a twin. You can't write somebody else's life story, but that's what they did. And when I went in there, get the book, not a single statement indicating that this was a project that Dr. King started or wanted or set aside materials for. No, this is created by them in order to continue with the dream. You know why the dream is popular? Because it's financially profitable. And that's the way, and every researcher on King knows that. But why in the world would the King Center, why were they promoting those Republican presidents like Bush and Reagan, people that spent their whole life to make sure that Black people never progress? Because of money. They would give money to the King Center. So this may sound uncomfortable to you, but it's well known that the King family has split. Some don't care about accuracy. They want the money. Others say, no, we can't, we cannot keep the King Center going. It's not profitable for us. We need to give it to the National Park Service to run. So there's been a split in the family. And the King family is the only family that is focused so much on money more than anything else. So a lot of Dr. King's legacy has been misrepresented and distorted, and the family has participated in it. They're not the only ones. There's biographers. I mentioned David Garrow, there's Taylor Branch, and a lot of other people who participate in it. So the family, for example, and now this is public. You don't have to go to the archives to learn what I'm sharing with you now. This has been public debates about, they want to sell, a couple members of the family, they want to sell his Bible and other things that he carries so they can make money. Others said, no, this is part of Dad's legacy. So they're not speaking. And anyway, it's a whole story about that. But people have been very political to make sure that the real King is not presented, because that's not going to be profitable. It's going to make a whole lot of white folks and others uncomfortable. A lot of Afro-Saxons running around distorting Dr. King's legacy because it's safe for them. And so Dr. King broke away from the more conservative folks in the movement. That's why there's two kings that we have to know. King during the first period, which he called the civil rights period, and then the human rights period. Okay, you have a lot of background, so I'm sharing more, but let me tailor it so that I can get through this, because I want to share specifically on human rights and go from there. So one thing I would say is that it's not a problem focusing on his birthday, but I say it's more important to focus on his death day, because it's more important for us to know what Dr. King lived for and what he died for. Just like in Christianity, it's not just when Jesus was born, but what did he live for? That's what Christians focus on, is that he supposedly gave his life and all of that. But that's how we have to look at King. So we shift from his birthday in January to his death day in April. You know what? That's an uncomfortable image to see Dr. King lying in the pool of his own blood. So it's important to make that shift because it raises important questions. And then that leads us to the primary sources, which I had mentioned earlier. But until we look at the sources, it's very difficult for someone to credibly argue that they don't agree when it's very consistent. And if King could tell his own story, and could see today how his legacy has been distorted, I'm clear that King wouldn't even recognize himself. He would not. And so we have to examine King and his shift from civil rights to human rights and Black power. And by the way, this shift is not something I came up with. This is what King consistently focused on, making sure that his colleagues in the SCLC and those in the movement were clear that times had changed from the birth, the movement from the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott over a 10-year period. Things had changed to the mid-60s. So he's talking about a shift to human rights and the acquisition of power. So this framework here is what I learned from his consistent arguments of two periods. And by the way, the other guy that's gotten a lot of credibility is Taylor Branch. who wrote Parting the Waters. And it just so happened when he wrote Parting the Waters around 86 was the first of the 3 volumes. I was working on my master's thesis, and Taylor Branch was a white guy in Atlanta who said on the radio that he never met Dr. King because of disinterest. And so he's on the radio. I called in. This is at Morgan State. I was still there at the time. And I said, Mr. Branch, I've heard your comments, but you did not say anything about the second period, the human rights period in Dr. King's work. And I'd like you to speak about that. Second period, I'm not familiar with. Excuse me, sir. You wrote a 1,000-page book. What do you mean you're not familiar with that? You're the Pulitzer Prize winning author. What do you mean you're not familiar with that? He shifted from civil rights to human rights, and I gave him and the radio audience a number of sources. So, oh, wow, this is interesting. Excuse me, sir. You're supposed to be an expert, and you're on live radio as a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and you telling me you're not familiar with this? Oh, yeah, let me get your number. We need to discuss. 30 years later, I ain't heard from the guy. So anyway, let me just mention these issues here of what he focused on, during the first period. But he shifts. Why does he shift? Because the times change. In fact, once the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64 and the Voting Rights Bill was passed in 65, Dr. King's organization and one of his aides, Bevel, said it this way. He said that Congress, in a sense, has signed the civil rights movement out of existence. That Congress, in a sense, has signed the civil rights movement out of existence. So what Dr. King and his organization looked at is, look, we've had a decade of struggle against the white nationalists, the white supremacists, the Jim Crow defenders, and we now have legislation on our side to aid our cause. We have the Civil Rights Bill, and we have the Voting Rights Bill. So for King, even though more work needed to be done in this, what he called the civil rights period, he believed that the bulk of the work was done because the legislation was on the books. So now Black folks, if they got beat up, it wouldn't be legal, because they actually had rights on the books. This is his argument. So he then begins in late 65 exclusively discussing, I might add, human rights. He said, this is the fundamental question confronting all nations. And he begins to focus on that. So he calls it the human rights period. He calls it the second period. So I'm simply echoing what he wrote. He began to talk about, it's not a moral issue, because King recognized what everybody else did. You can talk moral issues all day. It did not sway the vast majority of white folks. It didn't matter. So he said that it's a structural problem, that the whole edifice itself is corrupt. So we begin to question the whole system of not just racism and white supremacy. He called it white supremacy quite often, but he also said it's a structural problem, that the whole edifice is corrupt and needs to come down. And so he began to address these issues. Yes, he wasn't a fan of the phrase Black Power at first, but he was schooled by those activists in SNCC, particularly Kwame Ture, who was Stokely Carmichael at the time, and Willie Ricks, who's now Brother Mukasa. And I've had Brother Mukasa on my radio program a couple of times to discuss this. So if you read Where Do We Go From Here, you see that Dr. King embraces Black Power as not just a slogan, an empty slogan, but as a program to be implemented. And he made that very clear. How come this is not talked about? Because he's misrepresented. What about acquiring power? He doesn't believe that it's just trying to persuade white folks or just to kindly protest. No. Now it's about taking power. So anyway, he began to address these issues in the second period. He discusses revolution. He discussed the nightmare quite a bit, and he embraces armed revolutionary struggle. The one that you might be familiar with that's come out over the years is his speech Beyond Vietnam on April 4th, 1967, Beyond Vietnam, but much more than that. If you read really carefully and listen carefully, King had been embracing armed revolutionary struggles since really diligently since 1961. But what happened is that the real scared Afro-Saxons, they're the ones that attacked King, even before the media did. They said that Dr. King is irresponsible. He's taken away focus and resources from the civil rights movement. And the media then took that, they ran with it, and Dr. King made a strategic decision to back away from his support of revolutionary movements in Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia. They became independent through bloody armed struggle. He began to back away from his public support of the revolutionaries in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Kenya. And so they weren't simply out there peacefully protesting. You'll never hear a sermon or statement or anything by King condemning them or saying, look, we should support them, but we really wish they would be nonviolent. Not at all. He knew that these were winnable struggles, and he said so. He was concerned about folks in the US taking up arms. He told the young activists in CORE and SNCC in the Black Power movement that this is the real deal. And if you're talking about armed struggle in America, you got, he said, an extreme right wing, the military, the National Guard, and some white extremists that will not hesitate to use this term, exterminate Black men, women, and children. So you need to be realistic about bloodshed and not just talk about carrying weapons. And by the way, Dr. King made it very clear that the use of weapons and arms to defend oneself if attacked or defend their family, he said this has never been an issue, that this has been defended since the beginning of humanity. He said it's not a question of using arms, it's just a question of whether or not it is tactically wise to use or carry a weapon or a gun or a knife in a demonstration. He said that's the only issue. Is it tactically wise to carry a gun or knife during a demonstration? He said it's not tactically wise because the police and the National Guard, but particularly the police, that they will use a skirmish because somebody's got their weapon and they want to battle the police, that they'll use that skirmish against us, he said. And then they will focus on the skirmish and not the issues for which we are demonstrating. So Dr. King, if we look at him, he always had armed men around him. From the Montgomery bus boycott, that house in Montgomery was protected by armed guards. In fact, when Bayard Rustin came from New York to meet with Dr. King, for example, in his home in Montgomery to teach him about nonviolence, Bayard Rustin was about to sit down. Somebody said, hey, you gotta watch out. It's a gun, it's a gun under that sofa. He had a gun under the sofa and armed men outside. By the way, in that Mississippi Valley, them white folks would shoot them up in a minute and kill somebody in a minute. So Black folks had to be armed. Like one of the brothers wrote a book, that nonviolent stuff to get you killed. Everybody knew that. That's why Dr. King did not go preach a funeral on this Meredith March Against Fear in 1966, which became the Black Power March, until guess what? I ain't going into that Delta to preach no funeral with these rednecks and racists and trees and everywhere else. Guess what? He had the Deacons for Defense to protect him. Then he went to preach the funeral. This is a practical man. But the armed struggle issue was simply whether or not it made sense to carry that in a demonstration, not for self-defense. And by the way, anybody that looks at the records knows that this is not even a debate. The whole nonviolent tradition is bankrupt. Gandhi was not some pacifist at all. Read his autobiography. He said that matter of fact, Gandhi participated himself in 3 armed conflicts: the Zulu Rebellion, World War I, and another conflict, and nobody invited him. He just wanted to help the British in these conflicts so he can show that he was loyal to them. In fact, he said that, hey, when I was attacked in India, if my son had been there, it was his duty to protect me with arms if he had been there. And he said, look, I always prefer that people would take up arms. This is Gandhi speaking. I prefer people take up arms than be a coward. And nowhere in Gandhi's life is he a pacifist. He used nonviolence strategically because India was not going to defeat the British. It was a tactic by an Indian nationalist to gain independence. All one has to do is, Gandhi's not deceiving anybody. It's the press, it's the media, it's the biographers. They have a bogus tradition from Henry David Thoreau to Gandhi to King. None of them were nonviolent. Henry David Thoreau said that it's not about the gun, it's about the right use of the gun. And Thoreau said we need to fight against this system of slavery. That they all were able to embrace armed struggle, depends on context. Oh my God, are you saying that King was not a general? He was a general, yes, he was, but he wasn't leading a platoon with weapons. I'm simply saying that it is outrageous for anyone to suggest or state outright that King was unalterably committed to nonviolence, not abroad. At home, he was concerned about what would happen if folks start, and you saw what happened. You saw what happened to a lot of the bold brothers and sisters right here. They weren't prepared. They got shot up by the enemy. We saw what happened. I don't blame them, but King was a little older than they were. And you don't talk rhetoric. You got to do something about it and protect yourself. But anyway, there's a lot I can say there. That's what Wosey does. Are y'all informed people? I need to make sure that you get some juicy stuff. Yes, brother Imhotep.
You know, when I used to listen to Kwame Ture, he said that when King's house was bombed, he applied for a permit to carry a gun. And that's one of those things that most people don't know. You know, if you did, what, Martin Luther King, you know, carried a gun? Yeah, that's wow. Yeah, you're really exposing a lot
Yes, sir.
Here tonight.
Yes, sir. So I'm going to go ahead and get through this because I'd like to hear back from you all because we don't have all that much time. But let me document the evidence because documentation does beat conversation, so that tonight nobody on this Zoom call or meeting would have any doubt, and anybody that sees the video, that it ain't what anybody thinks. The record speaks for itself, that Dr. King shifted the operations from only fighting against the Jim Crow segregation in the South to now moving to the North to implement what he considered to be human rights and Black power. He begins it. Why late 1965? Because the voting rights bill was passed in August of 65, and that's why they begin to shift. So if you read his article, The Next Stop, the North, there's no debate. If we read his you can find this in the archive. You know, now so many things are online. A person may not have to do a lot of what I did, going to the archive, spending hours and hours, because people tend to post things. But his SCLC address in Frogmore, I didn't know until later that when they were having their annual retreats in Frogmore, I didn't know that was the South Sea Islands. So they chose to meet annually among Black folks. I didn't know that at the time, you know. But anyway, so take a look at that address. No debate. Also, take a look at his speech, The Crisis in Civil Rights. He's focusing, it's a crisis, and he's saying that we've moved past that. Yes, it's a crisis because we had to struggle all those years. There's still not a solution to the problem. We're dealing with human rights now. And so those are some sources, but also here's some other ones. Now check this out. What was the annual convention themes of his organization? I'm glad you asked. Let me share it with you. This is the annual theme: human rights, basic issues, the Grand Alliance. They ain't talk about no civil rights. That era is gone. This is a brand new era. Hey, by the way, anybody still talking about civil rights after the Black Power movement burst on the scene in June of 1966, guess what? They were increasingly irrelevant. They were. It was those that embraced human rights and Black power that remained relevant. The young activists in SNCC, the young activists in CORE, SCLC, the Black Panther Party emerges, and other groups. They were relevant because they were moving forward with the time. Take a look at their theme the very next year: human rights, the continuing struggle. They ain't talking about civil rights anymore. So in other words, anybody that describes Dr. King as simply a civil rights leader has distorted Dr. King. He's no longer dealing with civil rights anymore. He changed, he evolved, just like the movement changed and evolved. How can someone stay the same over 5 and 10 years and beyond? He did not. That's why you see the shift. This is why he's discussing the first period and the second period. And what's beautiful about Dr. King as a teacher and a leader, he's constantly explaining this to his colleagues in the SCLC and explaining this to those in the movement. And he explained, you should hear his beautiful explanation, his sense of what it takes to move people forward. And this is why, even with the I Have a Dream speech, he ends with, he had a dream because he talked for 12 minutes about the American reality, the American nightmare that Black folks were suffering. As a leader, you can't leave people on a sour note or a down note if you expect them to act. And this is why he said, but I still have a dream. And that's when the propaganda media picks it up. He's not there to talk about a dream. He's there to talk about the reality of Black folks have been done in by this vicious system. But he doesn't want to leave them on down note. And so that's why they let the public listen to the last 3 to 4 minutes of the speech, but not the first 12. But guess what I do when I do presentation? I flip the script. I play the first 12 minutes and leave out the last 3 to 4 when he's talking about a dream. Okay, now check this out. One of the great speeches he gave was on Human Rights Day. And he talked about the folks in South Africa, spectacular savages. But he says, as you can see very clearly, we live in an era in which the issue of human rights is what? Is what? The central question confronting how many?
All
nations,
Hmm.
including the US. And he said, by the way, our struggle here in the States and our struggle, he said, of our brothers, today we say brothers and sisters, but our brothers in Africa are the same, he says. They're the same because they're both based on struggling against, as he said, white supremacy and the contempt for life. He says that this is a human rights struggle, which is much bigger, much broader, much more important and global than just a civil rights focus. So this is the Dr. King that embraces human rights. He's not focused on civil rights after 65. This is why most examples that are given about King are 65 and earlier. And it's a distortion. You can't leave out the second King that emerges. So what about this speech? Now, this one I know is public. You can get the Human Rights Day speech in 65. And then check this out. When they moved the operations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference from the South to now Chicago, guess what? Same focus. We're raising the question of what? Human rights for those who have been denied these rights by the structures of our society. You got a very different King that emerged after the Voting Rights Bill was passed. And guess what? Everybody was put on alert because when the Voting Rights Bill was passed for the first time in the history of America, the very first time that all Black people, at least on paper, could vote. This had never happened ever in the history of this outrageous nation until Black people had to fight, struggle, and die just for that basic right. And guess what? The brothers and sisters in LA and Watts said, you know, we don't respect that. And they started to tear the city up 5 days later to let the nation know that this is BS. It excludes us. This don't mean nothing. We live in slums, we live in squalor, and this does not elevate us past our quagmire that we live in. So we're gonna blow it all up and let you know we don't respect the Voting Rights Bill. So King was taught. You keep in mind, he had a PhD, but his real PhD was in urban struggle. He learned in the streets. So when those people started to tear Watts up, LA, the so-called power structures called Dr. King in and to try to get him to make an announcement to get people out of the street and stop rebelling. I didn't say rioting, rebelling. And Dr. King told these suckers, I ain't no fireman. He said, yeah, it's unfortunate that they're tearing up the city, but guess what? This frustration is born out of real conditions. And then he went on to teach the opponent why people were rising up to tear the city down. And this is what helped to urge King to do something beyond what they had done in the first period in the South. And so here's one of his great speeches. Notice the date. It's just several days before he's assassinated, led by the FBI. How many of you are aware of this? Remaining awake through a great revolution. It's one of the great speeches, remaining awake. And he said that in this great revolution, he talks about who? Rip Van Winkle. The man went to sleep for 20 years. When Rip Van Winkle went to sleep, guess what? King George III was in charge. He woke up and there was a new man in charge, a new president, George Washington. So King often talked about Rip Van Winkle and remaining awake. And so he discussed this triple revolution and a revolution in technology, a revolution in weaponry to kill people in more creative ways, which was outrageous. But what do you think was the third part of this triple revolution that he discussed on a regular basis, if you're following what I'm saying?
Media.
Economics.
Okay, you got to follow what I've been presenting. So It's a revolution in what? Human rights.
Psychology.
No, human rights. This is what he's consistently talked about as the triple revolution. And so this is very significant. Why is this left out? Because it doesn't fit the script. And notice that it's the second part of the struggle for Dr. King and this human rights period. So that's part of this triple revolution that he discussed. So I'm sure you can get this. I got it in the archives, but as I said, you know, they got an archive here now at Stanford, but people have put a lot of things online. So I wouldn't be surprised if you can find this online somewhere. If not, hey, you know what? Put your shoes on and go to the archive like I did. Or if not, take my word for it. And check this out. So Dr. King on Black Power, some of you may have seen maybe Eyes on the Prize and some other footage where when the Black Power movement, when the Meredith March Against Fear took place in June of '66, this is when Brother Mukasa or Willie Ricks and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, told Brother Stokely that, man, we need to implement this now. So it was all a strategy to implement Black Power as a slogan. So the SNCC was already using the phrase, like in Mississippi and their different programs, they were already using the phrase Black Power for Black people. That phrase was being used, but nobody had shortened it to just say Black Power until Brother Mukasa introduced it along with Brother Stokely Carmichael on the march. And this march was to aid James Meredith, who tried to integrate the university, and he was shot on the highway. And the position was always the same, that anybody doing something illegal, and if they're attacked, they all would come together. The NAACP, CORE, SNCC, and SCLC, they would come together to aid them. But this one was different. The young brothers and sisters said, you know what, enough is enough. They kicked white folks out who had given time and effort and put their health and safety on the line, said, no, this is our struggle, you need to go. And also the activists said, you know what, we are no longer nonviolent. If they shoot and attack us, we're gonna shoot and attack them. And that was their position. And you know what, we ain't into this integration anymore. So guess what? The NAACP, oh no, we can't abandon these principles. So the NAACP left the march. John Lewis left the march. Other people left that march. Oh no, but guess who stayed? All of the SCLC. So they begin to shift and embrace Black Power. And King, and you can see footage where the white reporters got Stokely Carmichael, Brother Kwame Ture on one hand, one arm, and then Dr. King on the other. They're walking down the highway in this march, and he's got the microphone going back and forth between them, arguing and debating and working out what is Black Power. And that's when it starts. I mean, it's amazing footage. And then you see later on during that march that Dr. King is shifted. He's impacted. It's this clip of him saying, you know what? And then the police come, the troopers come, and they drop their tear gas to break up a demonstration, and people are coughing and trying to get out of there. They're being attacked. And then Dr. King emerges and said, you know what? If we had power, they wouldn't do this. So now he's talking about power. And this fell into the right in the strategy of Brother Mukasa or Willie Ricks, because they said Willie Ricks always coming to start riots. That's what they said. Anyway, so the Black Power movement and birth is very important, but nobody can ever leave King out if they're studying it. So you got to look at his retreat, what he said about Black Power then. One of the great essays that he ever wrote was Black Power Defined. How come they didn't put that in his autobiography with Claiborne? And by the way, Claiborne Carson is a known and respected scholar. He knows better. You don't take some documents and then write somebody. This is how, and write somebody else's autobiography, but this is how easy and open it is for someone to lie and distort King's legacy and not be run out of the discipline as somebody dishonest. It's just almost like a given. But why didn't they put this in the other essays in there and list all of them if you're going to write his autobiography? Because this is the growth of King. So in research, we got to look at the dates. So he would not have been talking about defining Black Power before 66. You won't see this in, let's say, 57. No, times change, and so did his focus as well. And I'm going to get through these really quick because I want to get your input. So we already talked about his last book, So you got to look at, the later years in his life. Remember, he was assassinated in 68. So this is, towards the latter period. And we already discussed the Poor People's Campaign, the Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged, but he wanted to dislocate the cities. That never took place because J. Edgar Hoover, who hated Dr. King, the man who was head of the FBI, they made sure that they assassinated him and took him out of his lobby because they said, and they leaked in the press, that Dr. King is irresponsible. He's going to create a bloodbath in DC. That's what they had in their internal memos, and they did everything they could. I'm talking about FBI agents like William Sullivan and J. Edgar Hoover and others. There was a FBI campaign to get King for the last 6 years of his life. It was the tightest surveillance in the history against one person. The surveillance on Dr. King was so tight he couldn't even wiggle. And so it was a whole orchestrated campaign to destroy him. And when he gave that I Have a Dream speech, and there's an estimated 250,000 people, William Sullivan, the next man in line behind J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they said that this is the most dangerous so-called Negro in America, not Malcolm, not anybody else. They were more concerned about King. You know why? Because they knew he had a big influence, a big following, and they could not buy him off. They couldn't corrupt King. This is the biggest concern, is that they couldn't do anything to stop him. And that's what frustrated Hoover. And that's why he came out to begin to attack King publicly. So in 1964, when Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, people praising him across the country and the world, Hoover came out and said that Dr. King is a notorious liar. And he has one of the lowest characters in the country. And King is trying to figure out, where is all this venom coming from? So he wanted to meet with this madman, but the madman didn't want to meet with King. And so it was another phase in this campaign to destroy King. They had FBI agents in this organization. They had everything was microphone. Everywhere you went, hotels, motels, microphones. They had all of the phones bugged in the office in Atlanta, hotel rooms. And so the whole focus was to destroy this man. He's dangerous, they said. And they even tried to get Dr. King to commit suicide. This was a letter sent right after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, where J. Edgar Hoover ordered William Sullivan and others, he ordered them to write a letter. They wrote this vicious letter against Dr. King. And I can take any part of this. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. You could have been one of our greatest leaders. You even at an early age have turned out to be not a leader, but a dissolute, abnormal, moral imbecile. And they go on to attack Dr. King and said he's a fraud. And they even wrote, and in fact, it was William Sullivan who penned this, and they sent it to the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta, but they mailed it, of course, no return address. They mailed it from Miami. So the FBI agent flew all the way to Florida, Miami, Florida, to write the letter. And then the letter goes on to say that Dr. King had 34 days. They were giving him 34 days because he's he's a fraud, and 34 days, and you know what you need to do. So this was sent, and the first person to read this was Coretta Scott King. She didn't really pay a lot of attention to it because what was accompanying the letter were some tapes, the so-called, the FBI called it highlights of King's filthy, abnormal self, and they thought that they were going to break up his family. So they tried to break the man's family, and this letter was a threat that you need to do what you need to do, and you know what it is. And they gave him 34 days. They're trying to get the man to commit suicide because the FBI had somebody else in mind. They had some Afro-Saxon in mind to show you how out of touch with reality they were. But the campaign was a vicious campaign to take him out of his lobby, and that didn't work. Dr. King, as a matter of fact, Dr. King didn't even get this until he got back from Oslo, Norway, after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. So the 34 days had already expired by the time he even saw it. But now the same guy I mentioned earlier, David Garrow, wrote a very detailed book with specific FBI files. Remember I said that you have to go to the file on the FBI headquarters of Black nationalist hate groups. They had spies, they had people, they had this guy, James Harrison in the Atlanta office. But even now we found out later, even Ernest Withers, the great photographer, was a spy. And this was shocking when this came out in 2010. What? Yes, they bought off a lot of people to find anything they can do to take Dr. King out of his work. So this is what was happening, because the FBI was very clear about Dr. King's shift from civil rights to human rights, and him now embracing Black Power as a program that concerned them. And they lured him to his death at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis on April 4th of '68. I could say quite a lot more, but I wanted to just at least prove the point, give you evidence and some ammunition that this man emerged as a pronounced threat to the US government and the dominance of white nationalism. And this is what concerned them. And King consistently condemned the Congress. He said the Congress is running amok with racism. And when the hot coals hit his lips, all those mayors that gave Dr. King keys to their city during the early period, well, you know what? In the late periods there, in the late period, they took the keys back and started to condemn King. And by the way, even the Jewish community became pronounced enemies of Dr. King once he began to threaten the whole economic system. So people can talk about all this unity now. Yeah, well, at the time, the folks condemned Dr. King. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you as Dr. King as a human rights activist. So that's all I wanted to present to you tonight. So thank you very much.
Great. It was great, but it was too short. But it's because of the time limit, and this is why I love to have you on Black Knowledge Matters. You mentioned something, and this is something I believe that is true, but I thought I'd run it by you. So J. Edgar Hoover had been involved in a lot of people's African nationalist demise, going back to the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. Isn't that correct? He
Absolutely.
Yeah. So going all the way back to Garvey and Malcolm, and there was somebody in between that I'm losing track of. But I just wanted to say that we have a couple of hands. The first one is Minister Malik. Go ahead, Minister Malik, with your question.
Thank you, Minister Imhotep. Professor Manu, it's always a pleasure. What an excellent, outstanding presentation. I mean, you're so passionate and thorough and pragmatic and thought-provoking. I've seen many lectures and documentaries on King, like most of us have, but you could actually be his spokesperson, as far as I'm concerned. But my question to you is this: now you identified two periods. First period you said was a civil rights period, and the second period was a human rights period. So my question is, do you foresee a third period? And if so, how would it be defined and by who or whom?
Yeah, I appreciate that, brother. I think if we were looking at Dr. King's framework, we're still in the second period, because he defined the first period as a period for Black people to gain dignity and respect. He said, nobody can ride your back unless it's bent. But he said that the second period is not going to be bargain rates for white folks. They're going to have to give up something. So he also said that the second period, he did call it human rights and Black power, but he said it's about the acquisition of power and the realization of equality. He also added that in there. So until we're able to acquire enough power to control our own communities and destiny, then by King's framework, we're still in the second phase. And if we take the big picture, we're in 2020, but from a big historical picture, sometimes 50 or 60 years is not always a long period of time when we really look at the grand scope of the historical period. So I would say that we're still in that second period right now. because when Dr. King mentioned that white folks are going to have to give up something, literally, they're going to have to give up power and control. I think that's where we are now, even though there's been some nuances. So that's how I would see it, brother.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, sir.
Minister Amadi is next. Go ahead.
Yes, wonderful presentation, Professor Manu. So my question is, what do you think of? What would you have to say about the book that Tavis Smiley wrote, where he talked about how in his last period before he was assassinated, that King was marginalized, by the Black community, by the Black leaders, and that he was really like, very much demonized. So I want to just ask you, about that particular period and what you had to say about Tavis Smiley's book.
Okay, thank you for that. I remember the book came out some years ago, right? I
Yeah,
kind of remember that. But in general, the point is definitely correct, because in '66, King had a split not only with those civil rights. You know what Dr. King called these cats in the Urban League and the NAACP? He called them literally Mickey Mouse Negroes. That's his way. That's what he called it. King said, how can I have any credibility associated with Mickey Mouse Negroes? And what happened was this, is when the Black Power movement, when the Black Power movement burst on the scene in June of '66, the Dorothy Height and Whitney Young and Rustin and the so-called Big Seven, they came out with a statement to the New York Times on October 14th of '66 to literally condemn the Black Power advocates. So during their press conference, when these 7 so-called leaders came out to condemn them, one of the reporters asked, what was Dr. King's position regarding their statement? And they tried to link Dr. King to their statement. So this is why he called them Mickey Mouse Negroes. He wanted nothing to do with them. So you can probably find this online, but October 17th of '66, Dr. King took out his own ad in the New York Times to do what? Clarify his stand. And so he did not endorse that statement. He did not associate with these folks. In fact, he was talking with his advisors to find a way to disassociate with them. And he blamed Bayard Rustin for trying to link him into this anti-Black Power position and public statement. So that position, Minister Amani, is correct. That Dr. King had problems with these folks. He called them Mickey Mouse Negroes, and he wanted to separate from them as much as possible. And this is why he embraced the young activists in the Black Power movement and those that were embracing armed struggle. He was just a little bit more measured, but he certainly split. So there was a fundamental split in the movement. There was the conservative civil rights folks, and some of them were not just focused on just civil rights and integration. Some of them took it to a level that they wanted to, and they argued amalgamation. Like one guy talked about that in 2 generations, there'll be nobody as dark as I am. Whoa. So they wanted amalgamation. Wow. And by the way, that brings me to one other point to show you how King differed with them. Nothing in Dr. King's life was focused on integration. Look at the four areas. This is how he separated himself from these folks. Number one, even though he mentions the term integration, the media comes up with integration or separation, but those are simplistic terms. King never was focused on integration. Number one, his family was all Black. He could have went into an interracial marriage if he wanted to. He did not. So his family was all Black. His church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, all Black. His neighborhood, the Auburn Avenue community in Atlanta, all Black. He could have went into an integrated neighborhood if he was focused on integration, but he did not. So his neighborhood was all Black, and his organization, SCLC, was all Black. And in fact, people criticize, well, his Black organization is all Black. He's supposed to be a civil rights leader. So then he brought in Stanley Livingston as one of the advisors, as a white guy as an advisor, and the FBI criticized that. So think about this, folks. So his family was all Black, his neighborhood was all Black, his church was all Black, his organization was all Black. Every main aspect of Dr. King's life was all Black. But look at the integration list, and their lives were completely different. And this is why they were fundamentally and ideologically against King, and they're the ones that came out to condemn Dr. King for internationalizing the struggle, because they knew their place was to only deal with quote unquote Negro business and not international business, to deal with the international struggle against white supremacy and the contempt for life, as Dr. King called it. So yes, brother, that position is correct, is well documented, and King fundamentally split with these folks, fundamentally.
Thank you. That's good. That's good to know. Thank you.
Sir, you're welcome.
All right, great question. Next up, Mama Afua, go ahead.
My question is, he spent time in Ghana,
Yeah.
and it seems as though everything that's been mentioned so far has been responses about him in the USA. What kind of responses for MLK did we get from Ghana and from other nations, even the Caribbean?
So he was invited to the inauguration of Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah in March of 1957 to that inauguration in Ghana. So King spent a little time there. He didn't really spend a lot of time on the African continent because he was busy traveling what was estimated about 325,000 square miles, flying to different places to help different communities that were fighting against, as he said, white supremacy. And so he does not spend a lot of physical time in Africa, but he does spend a lot of time corresponding with folks throughout Africa who are struggling for independence. And so that's how we have to understand his interest and focus. But he had Tom Mboya and many other activists. He had an ongoing correspondence with people in Ghana, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Kenya, you name it. And but he doesn't stay there. He's not even home very often. He's everywhere. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. And that's, so that's why he traveled so much and so many miles. He tried his best to try to be at home on Sunday, at least if he can do that, but that didn't always take place. He was in India helping Black folks, and then when they considered him like an untouchable, he didn't think of it that way until he thought about the condition of Black folks in the US and those in India. He said, yes, we do have the same struggle. So that's what I would say. But if you want to know about King in Africa, then like a Birth of a New Age, that's an important document. You probably can find that online, Birth of a New Age, and any of his major speeches, you'll see that. And also regarding Africa, King was a prominent member and founder of the co-founder of the American Negro, the American Negro Conference on Africa. The American Negro Conference on Africa. And they were specifically organized to help with the decolonization or the freedom movement. So you want to look at that, and Dr. King and others, and they rejoice with those nations that had joined the community of free nations. And they're talking about those that won armed struggle against the European colonialists. So the American, and then there's also, I'm sorry, excuse me, let me make sure I said this right. The American,
Not the
Negro,
ANC.
I'm sorry, the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa.
Not
Okay,
the
so
ANC.
American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, and you look at Dr. King's prominent role in the American Committee on Africa. Now, in the American Committee on Africa, the same thing. They wanted to help with the freedom struggle. And George Hauser was the director, and George Hauser went to Africa in the height of the armed revolutionary struggles, and he came back and said, we got to support these revolutions. And so King and others on the executive board, they endorsed a public statement where they are embracing these revolutionary movements. And again, these countries were, if anybody looks at how they became independent, take a look at Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and North Africa. Take a look at Kenya. Take a look at Zimbabwe and South Africa, and look at that they were fighting and winning their independence through armed struggle. And never once did King have a concern about that. Now Ghana kind of negotiated this independence. So Ghana was different. There's no armed struggle in Ghana, but other places, yes. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, the most public of the speeches, not for scholars, but for the average person, was his Beyond Vietnam speech on April 4th, 1967, where he says that we in the West need to support the barefoot and shirtless people of the world. And he said that what was happening in the world was it was an international revolution. He said that he used a German term called the zeitgeist, which meant the spirit of the times. And for Dr. King, he defined it as a revolutionary spirit. And as a minister, he was concerned about the least of these as supporting folk. He didn't say we should support them, but they need to be nonviolent. No, he saw them as human beings. He's a minister. He's concerned about the least of these. And he called for the support of these revolutionary movements, not only through the American Committee on Africa and the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, but through his own sermons, his writings, and his press conferences. But again, he was attacked by the real integrationists who wanted to stay in a safe area and not internationalize the struggle. And that's the only reason King pulled back in the first period around 63 or 64. But after he weighed what was happening, and when he came out in 67, he said, you know what? It doesn't matter what they think. There's a recording of Dr. King where he's talking about the domestic impact of the war in Vietnam. He said to American brutes that the bombs you drop in Vietnam explode at home with the rebellions, the urban uprisings. And so King, he had an international view, but Africa was at the center of his concern. And that's why he had more records and more correspondence with people fighting for independence on the African continent. But he himself does not spend time on the African continent, just like the Honorable Marcus Garvey. He did quite a lot, but Garvey never visited Africa. And that was by choice, even though he's promoting for Africa. So anyway, that's just some background that we should know about King's work.
All right.
Is that in any of the
Excuse me, Mama Fu. We have 3 other people, and
yeah, but he hasn't finished my question. Can you just give a brief? Can I just ask a brief question?
Well, I'm just looking at. We're at 6:22. We have 3 questions, and we're trying to end at 6:30 for
Women of Say.
So okay, go ahead as brief as you can.
Real brief.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I just want to know, now that we have Martin Luther King Jr. official holiday in the USA, is that celebrated any place else outside, especially in Africa?
Not that I'm aware of. He's honored, but I don't think it's an official holiday anywhere. And it was a struggle here, by the way, and those folks in Arizona saw it. They said, no, it ain't gonna happen. They only bowed down and backed down when the Super Bowl was not there, and these suckers lost tons of money and businesses started to go under, and they were forced to respect King. But no, not outside the US as far as I know. They only honor him, in general, but no official holiday.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Baba Jeff, go ahead. And then Katabasi, and then Judy. All right.
Professor Manu, thank you for deepening our understanding. Just love you when you come on and do that. Real quick question. Of course, they're chipping away at those voting rights and I guess the civil rights laws that were passed part of the was it the second or the first? This first stage, and now so you were making that between civil rights, human rights. What do you think he would say about that? Chipping away at that, because it's kind of the pattern, right? You think you've got 2 steps forward and then they take it back. What do you think he would say about that? What strategy do you think he would?
Yeah, I think we can see what King would have done if we look at the stance of John Lewis. John Lewis staged a sit-in in Congress to expose these hypocrites because they want to not renew different sections of the voting rights bill so that the white nationalists can do what they want with voting and new laws. So King would have championed that because he was championing that. But he also would have continued to look at the bigger picture of human rights as well, because we see that. It's just that more of us have to expose the records and not allow the media and biographers to take the cheap way out and write only what's popular and not what King actually said. So it's a lot of people to blame for that, including members of his family, because they know better. They know better.
All right, Brother Katabasi, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor Manu, for a
Yes,
very
sir.
informative and insightful presentation. I was wondering, as Dr. King moved increasingly towards the Black Power side of things, was there any indication that he was more inclined to communicate with Malcolm? Or was there any movement with him and Malcolm during that time that's of any significance?
Great question. And the answer is absolutely yes. Malcolm, when Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam in late 63 and 64, he formed, as you know, the Afro-American Organization Afro-American Unity. He begins to travel internationally. But when Malcolm came back in 65, he went to Selma. When King was in jail in Selma, Alabama, in the Selma campaign, he went to specifically meet with King and say, let's partner up. He didn't get a chance to meet with King, but he went for that. He did meet with Coretta Scott King. So Malcolm and Martin, they met early February, and literally 2 weeks later, Malcolm was assassinated. I think that was one of the biggest concerns outside of trying to stop King. The bigger concern was for these two forces to come together.
Right.
And when Malcolm went down there to Selma, his main purpose was to say, brother, we need to work together, because if they don't give you what they want, they're gonna have to deal with me and my forces. And that's what Malcolm's strategy was. You're gonna give Dr. King everything he's asking for, otherwise there's a price to pay on my end. And the government said, nah. So yes, they were definitely coming together, and they had more in common than they had in conflict.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, and Sister Judy, last
Be
question.
very quick. Professor Manu, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Your presentation, so much interesting information. I'm from Tuskegee, and I can think back about my mother and daughter born in Montgomery. And I just know we were only 36 miles away from Montgomery, and so much happened between Tuskegee's campus and SNCC, and the civil, and just all the civil rights protests. But I was talking to someone earlier, and the only comment I wanted to say was that I was sharing with them how strong people were, Black people, even though I know there were some who were afraid of King, but there was definitely collective unity amongst the people as far as boycotting and, pushing through it. Many of the people were afraid to be maybe on the front line, but, my parents were involved, but it was just fascinating to hear your story. I can't say anymore, and I know we're out of time, but thank you very, very. Is Mikasa in Atlanta? I think I saw him last week.
Yeah, he's still in Atlanta, and during the George Floyd uprisings, he was out there with the young folks, and they didn't know who he was. He said, "You need to Google me."
He's very outspoken, very outgoing.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I asked Brother Mikasa. It was all this debate about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they were marching to Montgomery and protest for voting rights, and where folks were beat up. And Edmund Pettus was a grand dragon of the KKK. And I asked Brother Mikasa, what's your position on this debate? He said, you know what? We need to blow it up. He said, we need to blow up all the monuments with their names. So not rename it. He wanted to blow it up. And I interviewed him, I think last time was probably, I'm thinking maybe 2 years ago. So you're right. I
saw him. I was just going to say, too, people of Alabama, a lot of times people put down people in the South, but the people of Alabama, particularly, and other surrounding Georgia and Mississippi, they were the soldiers on the front line, that unity. And they pulled together with the bus boycott in so many ways. They boycotted products and things. There was everybody was aware of who the enemy was.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, I'm going to have to end it there. Thank you so much for what a great presentation. Let's take ourselves off mute and let's just give it.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Professor,
thank you for your hard work.
Yes.
Thank
Professor
Thank you for your
Manu,
diligence.
wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone for your questions and observations. It is now 6:30. I just want to let you know that next week, Sister Celeste will be talking about financial matters here on Black Knowledge Matters.